Northwest 188, captain and first officer talk too much, forget to land. A commercial airliner carrying 149 passengers suddenly fell into complete silence with the ground. No response, no radio signal, no message, no communication. And worse, it overshot its destination by 240 kilometers. The entire aviation world was holding its breath. Control towers panicked, the military readied fighter jets for the air. Was this a hijacking? A double stroke in the cockpit? Or was something more terrifying happening that no one knew about? That is the true story of Northwest Airlines Flight 188, one of the aviation mysteries that shook the entire United States in late 2009. And the media at that time quickly concluded the two pilots were so engrossed in their personal laptops that they forgot that they were flying an Airbus A320 carrying nearly 150 people across the American sky. But was it really that simple? Let's go back in time to the afternoon of October 21, 2009. At San Diego International Airport, California, the busiest airport in the United States with only one runway but handling up to 25 million passengers a year, everything was still going on as usual. Flight number NWA 188 was cleared to depart on time, leaving San Diego for Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota. The aircraft that made the trip was an Airbus A320-212, serial number 1646, delivered to the airline in 2001. It was equipped with two CFM56 turbofan engines, one of the most popular engine lines in the world. There were 154 people on board, including 149 passengers and 5 crew members. Leading the flight were two veteran pilots, Captain Timothy Cheney and First Officer Richard Cole, both with decades of experience in the cockpit. At 14:40 local time, the control tower gave NWA 188 permission to push back, start the engines and take off from runway 27. And at exactly 17:01 Central American time, the Airbus A320 lifted its wheels off the ground, heading northeast, entering US airspace. Initially, everything went smoothly. The plane quickly reached cruising altitude and stabilized its speed. But then, about an hour and a half into the flight, while over Denver, Colorado, more than a third of the way through the flight, something went wrong. A flight attendant approached the cockpit, knocked on the door, and announced that the crew's meal was ready. The captain left his seat to use the restroom, handing over the controls to the first officer. At that moment, an urgent radio message from air traffic control came through. Northwest 188, change frequency to 125.9 and contact Denver Center immediately. The first officer immediately switched frequencies on the control panel. But here, a small error had occurred, and it was enough to plunge the entire plane into deadly silence for more than an hour. Can you guess what the error was? Why was the plane still flying, but no one knew where it was? What was really happening in the cockpit of Northwest 188? Don't look away, because the next part will make you amazed about the seemingly unbelievable thing that really happened in the sky of America that year. And then, just a small operation brought the whole flight to deathly silence. Instead of dialing the correct frequency of 125.9 MHz of the Denver Air Traffic Control Center as requested, the first officer of Northwest Flight 188 accidentally entered a completely unfamiliar frequency, the coordination frequency of Winnipeg Center, Canada, hundreds of miles away. And the irony is, the radio equipment did not emit any warning. No beep, no red flashing light, no error message. Simply, enter the number, and call. Good evening, Denver Center. This is Northwest 188, stable at 37,000 feet. The first officer's voice rang out confidently, but on the other side, no one answered. Not a single answer. No acknowledgement, no one listening. Normally, these kinds of errors would not have serious consequences. The pilots would notice the unusual silence, check the frequency, and quickly correct the problem within a minute or two. But this time, things were going terribly wrong. At cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the first officer's headset still picked up the scattered sounds of other aircraft communicating with Winnipeg Center, creating the illusion that the radio was still working properly. An elaborate auditory trick. And for a moment, everyone was lulled to sleep by that familiar sound. A few minutes later, the captain returned from a bathroom break. Anything new? He asked. Nothing, everything is normal, the first officer replied, with absolute certainty. The captain put on his headset, hearing the usual radio crackle. There was no warning signal. There was no doubt in his mind that the entire crew had been completely disconnected from the air traffic control system. According to procedure, when one pilot leaves and returns to the cockpit, the other is required to provide a full briefing on all changes, navigation instructions, radio communications, and the frequency being used. But not a word is said. And that was the moment Flight 188 took a dangerous turn, where every warning signal was ignored, and no one realized what was wrong. After the first unanswered call, the first officer did not try again, nor did he reset the frequency. In fact, it was not uncommon for a response not to be heard immediately in the air. Pilots sometimes waited several minutes before trying again. But this time, they did not wait just a few minutes, it was over an hour. An hour of absolute silence, while on the ground, the controllers panicked. They called and called, no answer. They sent ACARS messages, no response. The plane flew. Still on track. But completely silent. In the cockpit, at 1850, when both pilots had returned to their stable positions, instead of checking communications, they began to discuss an unexpected topic: the airline's new electronic flight scheduling system. A normal conversation, in a completely abnormal situation. Neither of them knew that the plane had already exceeded its destination by hundreds of kilometers, and on the ground, the US military was preparing to send fighter jets to intercept. But what no one expected was, at the moment the plane lost contact, both pilots were engrossed in a personal laptop. It was the airline's new electronic flight scheduling system, a controversial change that made many pilots uncomfortable because of its complicated and difficult-to-use interface. The first officer opened the computer first, operating it while explaining to the captain how to use the new interface. Not long after, the captain also turned on his laptop. The two began to converse, talking and working, engrossed in their computer screens, unaware that they had ignored all the warning signals that were silently flashing outside the cockpit window. The Airbus A320 was now enjoying a strong tailwind at a speed of up to 185 km per hour, making it fly significantly faster than originally calculated. Meanwhile, the main navigation screen in the cockpit was set to the farthest range display mode, causing all the orientation information, airport landmarks, and navigation instructions to shrink, blur, and scatter like dust spots. This made it even more difficult for the two pilots to recognize the plane's true position, easily falling into a state of disorientation. And then, the A320 flew beyond the city of Minneapolis, its final destination, without the crew realizing what was happening. Meanwhile, at the Denver Air Traffic Control Center, controllers continued to try to contact Northwest 188 again, but there was no response. Then, a new shift. A new controller stepped into the cockpit. But there was a fatal mistake. No one had passed on the information that Northwest 188 had lost contact. Which meant that nothing was done. No emergency action was taken. No questions were asked. Because everyone believed the plane was communicating normally with the next control tower. An illusion of smooth operation, but in reality, the entire flight had been drifting into the air traffic control blind spot for more than an hour. Meanwhile, at Northwest Airlines headquarters, a dispatcher on duty noticed something unusual. The plane had been silent for too long. No radio transmission. No updates on the navigation system. And then, the man decided to take one last step before things got out of control, sending an emergency message via the ACARS system, the text communication system between the ground and the cockpit. A short message, but it carried the weight of an ultimate command: confirm your position immediately. The crew got it, or else they would all go into red alert. But would they realize how far they had flown? Or was it too late? But even that urgent message fell silent. On some modern aircraft, the ACARS message system is accompanied by a warning chime, a high-pitched sound that rings out in the cockpit, forcing the pilot to pay immediate attention. But the Airbus A320 that day was not one of those. It displayed the message only in a small, dim light, hidden away on the dashboard, and worse, the light lasted exactly 30 seconds. No chime, no vibration, no flash. Just a silent light, and then it was gone, as if it had never been there. And so, the urgent message from the ground, the airline's final cry for help, was completely ignored. No one in the cockpit noticed it. Everything in the cockpit seemed normal. The radio was still buzzing. The instrument panel showed no warnings. The plane was still at 37,000 feet. No sirens. No oscillations. No signs that they had overshot their destination by more than 240 kilometers, or more than 150 miles, in a state of near total loss of control. And that false sense of normalcy, was the most terrifying part of the whole thing. The two men sitting in the cockpit, 7 miles above the ground, thought they were doing everything right, when in fact, they had long since overshot Minneapolis. Overshot their destination. Overshot their control. And over the minimum safety margin the industry allowed. At 8:14 p.m. Central Time, a change began to spread through the back of the cabin. Murmurs began to appear, scattered at first, then growing louder. The passengers began to realize that the flight was taking longer than expected. No one said anything, but everyone sensed that something was off. The flight attendants did the same. Their professional instincts told them that something was wrong. One of them went straight to the intercom, picked it up, and called the cockpit. "Sir, the passenger is asking, are we almost there?" The question was soft, but in that moment, it was like a thunderbolt that struck the two pilots. The captain looked up from his laptop screen, his eyes slightly startled. He turned to the navigation panel ahead, his eyes wide. "Wait a minute, let me see." A few seconds later, the two of them in the cockpit suddenly fell into a suffocating silence. No one spoke. No one breathed heavily. Only the background hum of the electronics and the dim lights on the control panel remained, because now, they really realized what had happened. And then, the truth was revealed right on the navigation screen. As the captain's eyes scanned the digital map in front of them, both pilots were stunned. There was no longer any doubt. The name of Minneapolis Airport had long since slipped behind them. On the screen, their current location was the sky above the city of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, nearly 240 kilometers east of their destination. The A320 had flown too far. They immediately redid the Minneapolis ARTCC frequency, holding their breaths as they tried to re-establish contact. Minneapolis Center, this is Northwest 188. We are near Eau Claire. Please confirm reconnection. But on the ground, when the call came over the radio after more than an hour of complete silence, the tension exploded. No one believed this was simply a technical error. Since a plane carrying more than 150 people had been missing from radar for an hour, and now suddenly reappeared, the possibility of a hijacking could not be ruled out. A silent crisis was unfolding in the skies above the United States. The ground controllers wasted no time. To determine whether the plane was in the hands of a pilot, or had been hijacked, they immediately ordered the crew to perform a series of special radar maneuvers. Northwest 188, please execute a left turn at 37,000 feet. Maintain heading and altitude throughout the maneuver. Clear. Turn left at 37,000. Northwest 188. The Airbus A320 slowly circled the night sky. A small turn, but a life or death one. And as directed, it was executed perfectly. Radar readings confirmed, this was indeed Northwest Flight 188. The pilot was still in control of the cockpit. There was no terrorist threat on board. The plane had not been hijacked. Only then did the control center lift the alert. They cleared the flight to continue on to Minneapolis. And finally, at 21:14, the A320 landed safely at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More than an hour later than scheduled. No injuries. No physical damage. But the entire American airline industry had just experienced a terrible night. When the official investigation was opened by the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the two pilots, Captain Timothy Cheney and First Officer Richard Cole, were forced to admit something shocking. They had opened their personal laptops together in the cockpit, at a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, when the plane lost contact with the ground. They were busy talking and manipulating the airline's new scheduling system, a serious violation of aviation safety rules. Because according to Northwest Airlines' own regulations, the use of personal electronic devices in the cockpit, while controlling a flight, is absolutely forbidden. But this time, the price of a moment of distraction was a lost communication, a national security alarm, the whole of America holding its breath in anxiety, and an unforgettable warning for the entire modern aviation industry. The lights in the cockpit were still dim, the control panel was dotted with small dots of light like a miniature starry sky. But now, there was no star bright enough to warn them of what was happening. The captain frowned, staring at the navigation screen, where the flight path was drawn out clearly like a taut red thread. And then, he froze. The current coordinates were nowhere near the destination airport. In fact, they had already passed it by quite a distance, and the plane was still hurtling forward at over 800 kilometers per hour, without any corrective orders from the crew, not a single signal from air traffic control. The first officer understood too. Without a word, he reached out to turn off the screen of the laptop that was playing an action movie, his eyes gradually shifting from amusement to concern. They had flown past their landing point by at least half an hour, and if it weren't for the call from the flight attendant, they would have continued to drift in the sky for hundreds of kilometers more. An eerie silence fell. No sirens, no emergency bells, just the hum of the engines and the rapid heartbeats of the men on board. For a moment, both pilots felt as if they had lost all sense of control, and it was that feeling, the feeling that they had no control, that was truly terrifying. The captain quickly adjusted the frequency channel, dialed the control tower. No response. He tried again. Still silence. No one answered. It was as if the A320 was floating in a deserted sky, abandoned in an unattended world. For the first time during the flight, genuine worry was evident on their faces. What had happened? Where were they? And most importantly, how long had it been since they had been in control of themselves? The air in the cabin began to thicken. Worried whispers turned to questioning glances. Children dozed off, adults began checking their watches and connecting schedules. But they didn't know that, up ahead, something had gone off course. And the only question that echoed in every pilot's mind at that moment was, is it too late to turn back? The captain immediately tightened his grip on his headset, his eyes glued to the navigation screen as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His face paled. They had flown more than 200 kilometers past their destination without anyone in the crew noticing. It wasn't the weather, it wasn't a serious technical problem, they simply didn't know. In that moment of silence, the entire cockpit seemed frozen. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the wind blowing outside the fuselage. The first officer began to flip through the maps on the auxiliary display, his hands shaking slightly, his voice faltering. "We're off the program route." At this moment, both men understood the seriousness of the situation. They had been out of flight control communications for over an hour without any corrective action. In aviation, any amount of time without feedback or corrective action, even a few minutes, can create a dire situation. This was over 60 minutes. In the air traffic control room, ground crews were frantically searching for the plane. For a moment, they suspected it was a hijacking, or worse, an emergency that had left the entire crew incapacitated. The A320 was still on, but no one in the cockpit answered any of the radio calls. The frequencies were eerily silent. Back in the cabin, the chatter began to rise. An elderly passenger worriedly asked a flight attendant, "Why haven't we landed yet? We've been flying longer than expected." Fear spread like a thin mist but could not be stopped. The flight attendants tried to keep calm, smiling professionally, but inside they were starting to panic. Some had flown hundreds of flights, but had never seen the captain stay silent for so long after a status call. Finally, the captain's voice came over the PA system, but it was not the familiar calm voice of takeoff. His voice was heavy and urgent. "We apologize for the inconvenience. The flight crew is currently dealing with a navigation issue. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts until further notice." No one in the cabin spoke for a few seconds. No one understood what was happening, but a sense of danger quietly crept into every gaze. People began to reach for their phones, some sent text messages, some turned on their cameras, a few prayed silently. The sky outside was still calm, but inside the plane, every mind was stretched to its limit. The captain stared at the navigation screen, his eyes frozen in place. A deadly silence fell over the cockpit. Then he quietly reached out and pressed the screen, zooming in on the electronic map in front of him. The faint blue flight path curving through the night was now behind him. There was no doubt about it, they had overshot their destination by a long time, almost half an hour, maybe more. The co-pilot was fidgeting, his face pale. He said nothing, just clenched his jaw and reached for the intercom. But at that moment, a chill ran through the cockpit. How could they have flown hundreds of kilometers without anyone in the crew noticing? No alarms, no air traffic control calls. No interruptions in the signal. The plane was still flying, as if it were flying itself. The captain took a deep breath, shaking as he pressed the ground call button. His voice was hoarse. "This is flight. We accidentally overshot our destination." There was a long silence, then a shocked voice from the air traffic controller. "Can you say that again?" In the passenger compartment, the murmurs had turned into loud questions. An elderly passenger stood up and asked the flight attendant in a worried voice, "Where are we going? Why haven't we landed yet?" The flight attendants looked at each other, forced smiles, but their eyes showed confusion. They had never been trained for a situation like this, a flight, lost, in the air, Not because of weather, not because of engine failure, but simply, no one noticed. The captain tried to stay calm, his hands shaking as he adjusted the controls to change direction. But even though he had regained control, the haunting horror still crept into his every breath. How could an experienced flight crew let this happen? How could the entire ground surveillance system let an A320, with more than 100 lives on board, drift aimlessly for hundreds of kilometers in the sky without anyone noticing? That question, later, would be the center of an investigation that would shock the world aviation industry. But right now, the only thing everyone is waiting for is whether that plane can land safely. The moment he saw the flight path on the navigation screen, the captain's heart almost jumped out of his chest. The plane was no longer on the planned route. They had flown more than 240 kilometers off course, and no one in the cockpit had noticed until now. For a brief but stupefied moment, both pilots just stared at the screen without saying a word. The silence seemed to freeze the air in the cockpit. The captain immediately tightened his grip on the control stick, his eyes quickly scanning the parameters, while his other hand frantically turned the navigation knob on the control panel. "We have to turn back now," he said, his voice no longer gentle as usual but dry, urgent, and heavy with responsibility. They switched the communication frequency to the air traffic control center, trying to report the emergency in the calmest voice possible. On the ground, the controllers were stunned when they heard the plane's current position. It was a point outside the allocation zone, with absolutely no contingency plan in place. But within minutes, the turnaround option was activated. Other aircraft were rerouted, making room for the Airbus A320 to quietly but urgently turn around. In the passenger cabin, anxiety spread like a chain reaction. There was no more laughter, only skeptical glances. Some people cried silently, trying not to alarm their loved ones. Flight attendants began walking between rows, gripping the armrests as if searching for some stability in the spreading uncertainty. The plane descended decisively but cautiously. The engines were retuned to conserve fuel, as no one was now sure they had enough fuel to reach their destination in time. On the dashboard, the fault indicator light remained off, but its silence sent a chill down one's spine. At 12,000 feet, the ground began to loom behind the clouds. The captain adjusted the rudder slightly, his eyes never leaving the runway that was looming in the distance. Ground control confirmed that the weather was clear, the runway was cleared. But then a new problem appeared, the fuel gauge was flashing red. There was no time for any more turns. The A320 had to land on the first approach. No mistakes. No skids. No shaking hands. Everything depended on this last moment. They turned around, but the consequences did not stop there. As soon as the Airbus A320 landed safely at the airport under air traffic control orders, a series of investigations were quickly launched. First by the Federal Aviation Administration, then by the National Transportation Safety Board, then by the Airlines Operations Department. Both pilots were asked to leave the cockpit immediately and escorted to the airline's representative office at the airport. There, they were separated and interrogated. The content of the conversation in the cockpit was extracted from the CVR cockpit voice recorder system. That's when the truth gradually emerged. For nearly an hour, both of them completely ignored the navigation system or the ACARS system messages. The reason? A technical document on a laptop had drawn them into a heated discussion unrelated to the flight. The investigation showed that, at the time they flew more than 240 kilometers over the airport, the automatic system sent an ACARS message to warn, but as mentioned before, this plane had no bells, only weak warning lights that disappeared after 30 seconds. A small design flaw, but in this situation, became a fatal flaw in the risk control process. Investigators also scrutinized the pilots' flight histories, qualifications, and psychological profiles. They had thousands of hours of flying experience and had never had a serious accident. But their overconfidence and reliance on the autopilot system had caused them to forget the most important thing, the duty to monitor the aircraft at all times. In its final report, the National Transportation Safety Board noted that this was a classic example of digital distraction in the cockpit. A situation that even the most experienced pilots can fall into when everything seems to be running smoothly. The recommendations were mandatory visual and audio warnings for all older aircraft, and a ban on the use of personal devices during flight, except in situations related to flight operations. The public was confused. Airlines were pressured to review all procedures and equipment. The passengers on board that day, although no one was injured, were all in a state of panic, not because of the plane's malfunction, but because of the feeling of helplessness that their entire fate for more than an hour was not really in anyone's hands. And the two pilots? They were suspended indefinitely pending the final results. No one knows whether they will return to the cockpit. But one thing is certain, after this incident, the entire aviation industry had to take a deeper look at the limits of technology, and the irreplaceable role of humans, even if it was just a glance at the radar screen. The incident ended with more questions than answers. But for every passenger, every person who steps into the passenger cabin of a flight, whether it is a long-haul transcontinental flight or just a few hundred kilometers inland, the following reminders are never redundant. Always observe and pay attention to flight times, announcements from flight attendants, and if you have any unusual feelings, do not hesitate to ask. There is no need to be overly concerned, but alertness is always a vital factor. Many serious aviation accidents could have been avoided if someone had asked the right questions, at the right time. Never be subjective just because you think the pilot knows everything. People are people, and fatigue, stress, or even a momentary lapse in concentration can happen. Planes may be programmed, but people make the decisions. And if you see something strange, an unusually long flight, no itinerary updates, or a flight attendant who seems confused, ask. A timely question can save hundreds of lives. Finally, always wear your seatbelt, even if the light is off. Most cabin accidents involve impact when the plane is suddenly shaken. And it's in the most normal moments that you need to be most alert. The sky is a place that humans have conquered, but it is always full of uncertainty. And you, the person sitting in the passenger compartment, are also part of the safety of the flight. Not because you are flying, but because you always have the right to ask, always have the right to know, and always have the right to survive. Thank you for following the story until the end. If you find this content useful, interesting, or helps you understand more about the mysterious and potentially risky world of aviation, please take a second to like, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Our channel will continue to bring thrilling stories, valuable lessons and never-before-revealed hidden corners of aviation incidents around the world. Each of your subscriptions is a great encouragement for us to continue producing more quality content. Hello and see you in the next videos.